I think a question that interests us is the question of meaning within a context of nihilism. Why nihilism? Because nihilism seems to be a disposition, an atmosphere that individuals confess to feeling, or if they don't confess it, they believe that they feel it inside. We believe that we experience nihilism within society. We believe that we exist within a context of nihilism. We are haunted by nihilism. Some people are plagued by nihilism, burdened by nihilism. But why nihilism? Because nihilism is the word that would seem to signify the loss of the value that we love, the loss of the meaning that we crave and desire. The claim would seem to be that nihilism is all-powerful, all-pervasive, that it has the capacity to shatter and break all philosophies, that by the blade of nihilism, truth dies, meaning dies, objectivity dies. It is the great sovereign supreme of thought in the world. We find ourselves drawn to it because we find ourselves immersed in it. At least we believe we are immersed in it. We believe that the experience of our sorrow is defined by the word nihilism. We believe that our confusion is defined by the word nihilism. We believe that it is linked up to our suffering, our loss of meaning. And so we are pulled in the direction of the concept of nihilism. We want to probe it. We want to understand what it is made of, what it means. We want to know whether or not nihilism carries some kind of secret. Perhaps this is the silent anticipation of the inquirer, that nihilism carries a secret power, a kind of philosophical formula that gives us access to reality in a way that nothing else can give us access to reality, which means it allows us to see reality more clearly, even though we anticipate that this sight is bleak and dark and cold and frightening. But yet we still believe that there is something significant about nihilism. What is nihilism? It's essentially the denial of value in the world. Whatever definition is wrapped up in nihilism, nihilism is going to contain the idea of a loss of value. At the very root, at the genesis of the concept, we will be dealing with the idea of a loss of value. What is this loss of value? What does it mean to lose value? It means that the structures that we presupposed as having authority, as having meaning, as having significance beyond mere subjectivity, it means that these structures fall, they crumble, they crack, they break, they do not hold. When the critique of nihilism comes against them, they fall apart. They lose their strength, and so we see through them, we realize that the values that we believe have been destroyed. They have shown themselves not to contain the authority that we assumed they contained. But why did we make this assumption in the first place? Why did we assume that these values contained a very specific kind of authority? What caused the genesis of this assumption? We make this assumption in relation to our values because we are born into them, and we simply presuppose that they are something different from what they are, that they have an eternal, timeless form to them. And there is a sense in which values have a timeless form, in the sense that they transcend segments of time, but that does not make them timeless. And so we find a loss of authority at the heart of values. This is what drives the nihilism. And so we ask the question, what is it that caused this loss? And we find the answer is the assumption of the authority of the values in the first place. What if nihilism is predicated on the false structuring of the ontology of values, meaning that we assumed these values to be something that they were not? And when we found out that our assumption about the nature of values was false, we then proceeded forward with the conclusion of nihilism. It all must be nihilistic, we say. Nothing matters, we say. Because we told ourselves that in order for something to matter, it needed to have a particular form. It needed to hold on to a particular set of assumptions or presuppositions. Presuppositions of authority, of legitimacy, of value. And when we find that these values, that this authority is lacking, that it does not match up, our presuppositions do not match up with the material reality of these values, the ontology, the idealist ontology, is in collision with the materialist reality. We end at the despairing conclusion of nihilism. But if this is the case, that our presuppositions regarding values has led to the conclusion of nihilism, then the error doesn't lie with nihilism. The danger doesn't lie with nihilism. It lies with the conditioning that caused us to arrive at the conclusion of nihilism. It lies with the presuppositions that led us to arrive at the conclusion of nihilism. Because we assumed an idealism about reality that was false, that did not hold upon examination of reality itself. Thus we conclude in despair, as a kind of psychological splitting, that life is nihilistic and life has no meaning. This crisis would seem to be invoked and generated by the formations of our own psychology, by the assumptions of our own psychology. Is nihilism then a position of assumption? Is nihilism then a position of presupposition? Is nihilism then ultimately an idealistic psychological disposition toward the world? Is nihilism an idealistic approach to the world? Nihilism not as a loss of value or meaning, but as a false idealism we project on the world that creates nihilism. It would seem to be that this is the case, that the error doesn't lie with the concept of nihilism or the critique of reason, but it lies in the presuppositional structure of the human psyche. The idealistic formation of an approach to the world. An idealistic approach that fails, thereby leaving us in a desert of nihilism. Not a real desert, but a desert that is constructed by our own revolt. As we rebel and revolt from a conclusion of reality that we don't like. What is that conclusion? That our values are not absolute. That our values are not timeless. That our values do not have eternal meaning. And what does the psychology do in revolt when it finds that these presuppositions are not actually there in reality? It revolts in nihilism. Nihilism is a kind of revolt from a failed idealism. A failed idealism that we do project in hope, but we project foolishly. Not an idealism that seeks to understand the world, but an idealism that demands that the world is a specific way. This is the cause of nihilism. This is what creates the reaction of nihilism in the species, which means the species cannot have nihilism in it unless it has first been preconditioned to accept a psychological disposition of idealism toward reality. Idealism, a kind of idealism, nihilism, is a kind of idealism. It is predicated and sustained by an idealism. By an idealism that finds a loss for itself in the world. An idealism that is negated by rationality, that is negated by reality. It is this negation, the sting of this negation is nihilism. The question can be asked then, what is it that we do about nihilism? And the answer depends upon how we are experiencing nihilism. Are we experiencing nihilism as a psychological state that we impose on ourselves through a subconscious idealism? If this is the case, then what's necessary is that we become aware of the lie of this idealism and transcend it. That we become aware of the lie of this idealism and begin to accept reality on its own terms. What does this mean? It means we give up the presupposition that in order for a premise to have value, in order for value itself to be valuable, it must be eternal. It must be objective. This was always a lie. When we give that up, and we realize that meaning was always contained within the finitude of existence, that it was never a property of infinity, but it was always contained within mortality, with infinitude, within the limit. It was not a part of the infinite. That was the lie of idealism. When we realize that meaning was always contained within the finite, then we recover meaning from the lie of nihilism. Because we learn that the things that give life meaning are the things that are constructed within the finite. That the finite has the capacity to give value and meaning to itself. More importantly, it always has. This is what it has always been engaged in. The assertion of the eternal, the assertion of the objective, the assertion of the absolute was always a self-deception of the form. That form was never eternal. It was never absolute. The primate simply believed it was eternal, believed it was absolute. And even in that idealist form, it still was not the agent of meaning. It certainly provided meaning in the sense of furnishing us with a hopeful belief, with a psychological, pleasant belief, but it did not supply the actual concretion of meaning in the world. That comes from human activity. The concept itself emerges from human activity. So the question is, how do we recover ourselves from the idealism of nihilism? And the answer, one answer, is that we realize that the idealism that creates nihilism is false, and that meaning and value do not need it. The eternal is not needed to construct value. The absolute is not needed to construct value. Unless by absolute we mean something that is still ultimately finite. But these concepts do not have to be realities for humans to find meaning, for humans to construct and create meaning. The meaning of life is forged through the activity of life, through the social of life. And if the quality of the social suffers, then the quality of life suffers. The question of how we overcome nihilism is a question that is asked within a context. And the reason it is a question asked within a context is because there are different experiences of nihilism. One experience that we have spoke of is a psychological experience of nihilism, an idealistic experience of nihilism. This is perhaps the easiest form of nihilism to overcome, though there are many who will never overcome it because they will cling to the idealism of their form. And it is this clinging that will prevent them from transcending the lie of that form and finding meaning within the concrete. There are different forms of nihilism, different experiences of nihilism. There are indeed absolute conditions of nihilism, unfortunately, but these are very severe conditions. I could give examples of them, but I don't really want to give an example of them because they are full of despair. But these conditions are not in and of themselves totality, which is what the propaganda of nihilism would seek to insinuate. That the worst experience is the most universal experience, and this is not true. So there is a lie of propaganda that takes place in the formation of nihilistic structures. Nihilists and nihilism tries to propagate itself by claiming itself to encompass the totality of experience, but it does not. This is a lie. The answer to the problem of nihilism hinges on the context of the experience of nihilism. And though we can't give a general answer for every form of experience, we can say that in many cases the solution to the dilemma will be found in the perseverance of thought itself. Thought itself in order to free the mind from the manipulation of idealism, from the chains of a subconscious psychology. This process of becoming free from nihilism is indeed a process of thought, of becoming aware, of being emancipated and transcending, but it is not merely a process of thought. We cannot reduce the refutation of nihilism to mere thinking, though it is a crucial part of overcoming nihilism. Combined with thinking, walking alongside it, contained in the same sphere of transcendence, is human activity. Thinking is itself a form of activity. In order to overcome different experiences of nihilism, thought will be an axiom, a fulcrum that is crucial. But experience itself must be added to this. We must seek out that which transcends the actual practice or function of nihilism. If nihilism, for example, is proliferated through isolation, then an individual who is experiencing nihilism through isolation would seek out community as a refutation of nihilism. The refutation of nihilism hinges on the context of the experience of nihilism itself, but we should not despair that nihilism cannot be overcome, because in most cases, nihilism is a reactionary lie that is based on a failed idealism, a lie that tries to suffocate us and restrict our creative capacity in thought, tries to restrict our ability to expand our thought, to think beyond the suffocation of nihilism, to choke us and bog us down. Its challenge is to try to get us to accept it as totality. That's its game. That's its ploy. It wants us to accept it as a form of totality, as that which covers all. And when we resist this lie with thought, we break it, we transcend it, we refute it. And when we refute it, we recover ourselves from nihilism.